Hi, this is a series of talks that I did on sense, art, history, and science of senses in humans a while back for Osher USF. And this segment is on smell and taste and natural history. Now, when we talk about smell and taste, they're so intricately related. And obviously, the smell is through the nose, and taste is through the tongue, as every child would know. Uh, when it comes to breath, breath comes in pairs. That is inhalation and exhalation, except on two occasions. First, when you're born, and second, when you die. Now, when you put numbers on it, you breathe about 23,000 times per day. Now, so that's the basic introduction to smell. And smell is part and parcel of your breathing. Now, when it comes to smell, it's something that's very hard to describe. We can describe the vision and hearing and measure it very precisely with the optics and physics involved and the sound physics. So there is a whole science of how to calibrate the two main senses, hearing and vision. But that's to measure smell. We don't even have good words for it. We just kind of go about in a roundabout way as to how delightful or refreshing or memory jogging, or on the other hand, either disgusting or intoxicating. That's why there is a whole science of describing the bouquet of good wine. So, but I think so we are at a loss to put it in words, so and different cultures have a different way of looking at it. Now, the study of smell, it's kind of on the periphery, but involves huge number of disciplines, starting from food scientists to obviously physiologists, biochemists, behavioral psychologists, neuropharmacologists, and not last but not the least, molecular biologists. And ideal and smell, the perception is directly into your brain. There's a whole new science of neurogastronomy that has come into forefront. And so the smell, I guess, somewhat like sex, it's all in your brain basically. So how you perceive, like if you are a fisherman, a smell of fish would not bother you. On the other hand, if you're a vegetarian, you would really get sick from it and nauseated. And the same way, the taste as to what you've grown up with has a huge impact as to how whether you'd consider it as a good smell or a bad smell. Okay, for example, a fruit that which is popular in Southeast Asia called durian, it smells disgusting, but people absolutely, are delighted in it's paid top dollar for tasting it. So there's a discrepancy between smell and taste when it comes to certain foods, and there is one a Korean dish, which is also comes to mind, which uh, fermented, edamame beans, which is absolutely disgusting smell, but those people eat it for breakfast in China and Asia. Okay, now obviously, poets have had a great description of starting from the great American poet and Whitman, in The Leaves of Grass. As some of you may recall, that was one of the books that Bill Clinton gave to his, friend Monica Lewinsky. And it's the words are pretty self-explanatory. And odor I bring from the forest of pine in Maine, and a breath of Illinois prairie with open air. So he describes, Americana as to how it can be. Okay. And similarly, John Muir, it describes, when he traveling through California, he describes the air was streaming with fragrance. Pine woods are all fragrant, and when the wind was chaffing the needles and warm rain seeping through them. So, people have really become very poetic when it comes to smells, and when out in the nature. And similarly, in the introduction talk that I did on senses, we talked about how this whole idea of doing this class came about, when we talked about the memory of small Madeline. Bruce, was a philosopher and neuroscientist. How the classic books or tome rather that he wrote. Similarly, Vladimir Nabokov also speaks of his memory and describes the various smells, in his works. Okay. And moving on to, this was an interesting experiment that was done by National Geographic that some of you may recall if you're an avid subscriber of it, that in September, they sent out a survey to about 1.5 million people with scratch and sniff panels in the magazine issue. There were 6 cents that where people were supposed to respond to it, and they got some reasonable response, type of thing. And so then, and it was an interesting experiment as to how people were able to identify it. So there were one was not a very pleasant smell of androstenone, which is a chemical in your sweat. And then the second one was a chemical with a big mouthful of name called isoamyl acetate, which is plain words, it's a smell of banana. And then there is eugenol, which is the same smell of cloves. And last but not the least, the base perfume in which has been around since the ancient times. Galaxolide, the name may not mean much to you, but it's a smell of musk, a musk deer. And the last but not the least was mercaptans, which is the foul smell of gas, natural gas, and rose smell. So these were the smells that were there. And 50%, only 50% of people were able to smell all. So the spectrum was different. In 1/3 of the people could not smell sweat. And so that was an interesting experiment that was carried out as to how, even though we all share huge portion of genetic material, we are still different in our own way. Okay. And now this is an interesting spectrum of our mammalian relative mouse and man, so as to how many smells there are. So numbers are given in 10,000, but that's not, it's a real speculative science, and this is assessed by varieties of chemical method of mass spectrography and gas chromatography. And this is what is important to a mouse is the territory marking maternal suckling, and those predator smells, so those are the survival smells that are important for a mouse, and social senses. On the other hand, our repertoire is a lot more diverse, starting from floral smells and other plant smells, so we can just see as to how, what the mouse smells can be across the wide spectrum, depending upon your status as to whether you're a hunter or the hunted. Okay, so that was one way of looking at it. Now, interestingly, this is a lot of that is a genetic role of heredity. For example, people who are albinos, they have a poor sense of smell. And this has to do with how your olfactory epithelium is laid out. And the anatomists look at it, the yellowish coloration of the olfactory epithelium, and that people who have a more stronger yellowish tint have a better smell, apparently. Okay. Now, when it comes to a small hunter-gatherer tribe in Malaysia, called Yahai, and they have a very strongly tuned sense of smell, whether there's a genetic basis or not, or whether this is cultural from childhood. That's was and I was able to find. Like, so a lot of that, as to, you can say they have varieties of words, which we are at a loss to describe, as to see how different words for fish and meat smell, and at the same time the words for gasoline type smell, flower smells. So they have a lot more diversity in terms of they're more tuned to smells than an or average European or American may be tuned to. And one can easily tell that if you are walking down a restaurant row, one can easily figure out which one is an Indian restaurant or which restaurant is cooking kebabs, and some of the smells, how culturally we're affected, because all of us growing up have, our moms rub Vicks Vapor up. So that's a cultural norm that we are, and at the same time, if you are a handyman, you recognize the smell of WD-40. So there are varieties. So different cultures have a lot role in as to what we'll be able to tell or not. Okay. And that similarly, jumping on to the other aspect, science of flavor has also varieties of disciplines involved, not just genetics, but cell biology, physiology, psychology, neuroscience. Okay. And so there are varieties of receptors on our tongue which play a huge role. And there are chemicals in the food that bind to receptors in our mouth and noses, sending signals to our brain. Okay, so 80% of what we consider as flavor, which comes from our sense of smell, basically. So smell is the thing that decides your taste. For example, the sweet aroma of vanilla ice cream, tricks our brain into associating this sense with sweetness. And then again, how we get the feel of the mouth of eating a potato chip, that the nerves in the mouth react to the texture, the temperature, and other sensory information, creating, the sense of taste. And at the same time, the temperature, exactly if the food is cold, it's going to not taste that sweet, On the other hand, when it's nice and warm, it will taste sweet or bitter or meaty. Obviously, nobody likes to eat cold cuts, given a choice. And the same way, the sound has a lot to do with it, that sound of a pouring hot water in a cup is a little different and can provide information regarding the food's temperature, freshness, texture. Okay, so this is, and sometimes, the accuracy that we have is just amazing as to how, for example, there is a portion of a smell of pineapple that the brain can pick it up with only as little as 6 parts per trillion. So that's, our receptors are very highly tuned to the individualness. Okay, and then obviously we can not talk about the wine tasting ritual that is part of our culture. And you can see that a scientist from UC Davis had created something called aroma wheel for describing the various bouquets, and you can go around the circle, at least part of it, as to how, earthy smell or chemical smell of sulfur, and then let's say I can't read the floral smells, at the same time dried, fresh fruit-like smell and caramel type smell. So she had created a whole spectrum. So based on that, we can place and put some good terminology about the wine bouquet, either it's fruity or spicy or floral, okay, earthy, okay, or so depending upon the circles, how you're supposed to narrow it down as to how it. On the other hand, there are people who have a diminished sense of smell that here this cartoon illustrates nicely, and the caption said, "I think this is wine," obviously. So that's, you know, and similarly, the French have a whole science of it, the varieties of fruity notes, floral notes, vegetal note, toasty notes, so, and there are huge number of, as many as 48 various toasty notes, like of roasted almonds, roasted hazelnuts, caramel, coffee, dark chocolate, okay, and so varieties of smoky notes, so this is, and you can, order this, for reasonably some type of thing as to trying to recognize these varieties of smells that, and then when it comes to fruit, the lemon, grapefruit, orange, pineapple, and the list goes on and on, pear, blackberry, currant. So the list is about 23 different types of fruity notes, So this is, it's a very complicated science that has evolved with culture, and all about taste, which is basically a social sense, basically. So now the basic ones that you recognize, the sugar, salt, and bitterness, and recently, in the last few years, the taste of meaty taste, or umami, that was been, proposed as a different flavor that it became introduced. Okay, and similarly, that when it comes to sugar substitute, the accidental discovery, which was done by a scientist who had spilled some chemical and was a bit sloppy and did not wash his hands, and when he tasted it, he could just see that it was, really tasted extremely sweet. So that was the start of the sugar substitute industry, and obviously varieties of other chemicals have been, okay, and this that some most of the senses are transmitted to something called taste receptors, which we'll talk about at length. But salt is transmitted differently through something called ion channels, which is the sodium potassium that sets up a current, and so this is how the things are transmitted. And there are varieties of proteins that are involved, that I'll have a lot more to say about it as we go along, called G protein couple. Okay, and the taste of sour is acidic, basically, and so and some of the stuff is very has an evolutionary basis, because poison can be better in the same way. This is again related to varieties of proteins that change their shape and are help us assess the varieties of taste that we're able to identify. And okay, and then there are varieties of words that have become part of our culture. The food is so important that like for the zeitgeist, the words such as breaking bread or eating your salt, they've become part of their different cultures. And for example, when you go to Asian cultures, rice is considered sacred, and the rice has become part of the culture. And similarly, during the Catholic culture, the wine and wafers have a big religious and cultural connotation. Okay, the word taste itself comes from Middle English. The origin dates back to a word called tasten, which again dates back to Latin for something called touch. And so that's, it goes down to touch and taste, that's how the word originated. Moving on to taste, tales of umami. This was added to taste only in the 20th century, okay? And now, so that was a new concept that was unlocked as a fifth state of savory taste, and that became the fourth, fifth element, because it didn't fit into known category. How good are we at detecting the taste? Sweet, obviously, you can just see that the sweet is 1 in 200 parts, salt 1 in 400, sour. It's because it is survival link type of thing. It's which are a lot more sensitive. On the other hand, when it comes to bitter, which takes the cake, which you can detect just even the slightest bitterness, your tongue will be able to pick it up. Okay, and there are some people who are extremely sensitive to it, and we'll talk about it. I have a whole, I think, a video for that. Okay, and when it comes to spiciness, there is something called the Scoville index that has been proposed, and to judge the spiciness of primarily varieties of peppers. So there are, depending upon the origin, like how jalapeno, the Scoville index, runs into thousands. The commonly well-known jalapeno peppers have a Scoville index of 8,000, but there are some other varieties of chilies and peppers, and they can be extremely powerful, and their Scoville index can be as much as 3 million. There is one called Carolina Reaper, which is, really kind of nothing to sneeze at. Okay, so, and this has to do with the varieties of channels that were discovered, and that was a groundbreaking discovery that just was awarded with Nobel Prize in recent past. Okay, so that's so these are the basic taste. Now, this is something that may be a little hard to stomach, but we'll just play it.
The U.S. has a candy store, but one store in Pismo Beach, California, is beyond the usual taffy and caramel apples. If Hot Licks has its way, Americans will be snacking on everything from caterpillars and cockroaches to mealworm-covered apples. Larry Peterman is a candy man on a mission. For more than a decade, he's been promoting a valuable food source that most Americans find revolting. In a land of plenty, people resist. Larry knows why. From an early age, parents teach children to avoid insects.
In our culture, from the time that we're really small, we're taught to avoid insects. They might bite you like a mosquito or swallow. This got a good cricket in it.
But kids aren't the only ones munching on bugs. Around the world, more than 1,400 insect species show up on menus. Insect eating, or entomophagy, is part of healthy diets in Asia, Africa, Australia, and Latin America. This trend is anything but new. Archaeologists have found evidence of it dating to the earliest humans. Advocates of insect eating like to note that it's environmentally sound. Producing a pound of caterpillar takes a tenth of the resources needed to produce a pound of beef. And insects brim with vitamins and minerals. But despite all the benefits, most Americans can't stomach bugs.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Have a seat.
Unlike Larry Peterman, who celebrates them at his dinner party. The evening begins with Larry's version of the classic shrimp cocktail.
We just finished preparing a cricket cocktail. It's a lot like a shrimp cocktail, only instead of shrimp, we use crickets. Okay, folks, here's the first course. Yeah. Now enjoy. Yeah. While you're enjoying this, I'm going down and get your next course.
The main course is a stir fry, a special garnish.
Here we go. Dinner is served. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, ready?
Okay.
1, 2, 3, go.
Yeah.
Several courses later, Larry presents his piece de resistance.
Here it is, folks. What you've been waiting for. Now, don't let anybody dive in until everyone's been served, please. We call him a Pismo surfer. What it is a banana with whipped cream, and a really good cockroach hunter. You don't have to eat the wings. You don't have to eat the head, unless you want to.
Do you know where this cockroach has been?
We can do another one next week if you like.
Larry predicts he'll eventually
Okay, so that is something different. I don't know if I'm ready for it yet, but there you have it. This takes all kinds. And now the story is obviously well known to a lot of us and has appeared in Jeopardy quiz from time to time, from rare to common, as to how that it came out as a medicinal purpose of Dr. Chase's remedy and home remedy from mint from Massachusetts to New York to Kalamazoo. Okay, and so this was was spread, and now it is in 180 countries. So it come with baking powder, and again then it became a worldwide phenomenon and a huge American success story. Starting from the early 20th century. Okay, and the mint has been used in Japan for birth control, believe it or not, and there are varieties of this. And again, it's become part of the mouthwash for quote unquote fresh. Okay, so this is one of the, now this is an interesting observation that some of me have figured out, that orange juice tastes bitter after brushing your teeth, because the detergent stops the sweet from working and dissolves the fat. So that's one of the reasons why, it just causes the bitter taste. So it's like your chemistry at work without you realizing that there is one part of is acting on the other, and they're not working in parallel but opposed to each other. Now these are some of the fun facts type of thing that and licorice, it has very high in salt and sodium rather. And when you have Addison's disease, means your body is not producing enough cortisone. Okay, at that time people crave licorice. So that one way to replenish your salt. And then there is the usual association of pickle and pregnancy. Now, and obviously the people who are marooned on the Arctic thing, and they were able to kill the polar bear, and because they were starving, they gorged themselves on liver, which is extremely high in vitamin A, and needless to say, they went on to develop vitamin A toxicity. And the classical Japanese fish, which is poisonous, and it can cause not just numbing of your lips and in small doses, but can eaten in large doses, and if it wasn't prepared, can cause paralysis and even death. So there are specially licensed chefs who are the only ones who are allowed to cook this particular fish. And the association of chocolate and love is well known. And truffles have been associated with male pig hormone, and Coke and Cola association has been well known through the ages. Okay, so the fugu causes dizziness, cramps, and tingling, and then induces zombie-like sleep. Okay, and then the coffee has the two chemicals, theobromine and phenylalanine, and there was a reference to it in the movie 1984. Okay, between Winston and Julia. Okay, and then different cultures have different mores and taste for food. For example, the Maasai in Africa will drink cow blood, which I doubt very much. And the Chinese, do eat just about anything, from what I've heard. Including dogs and snakes. So, and contrary to the popular news, the Haitians do not eat cats. Okay, and now so there are different areas of word have different gustatory and dietary habits and taste. Now, obviously, the biggest taboo that is there still is associated with cannibalism, and the Europeans had this when they first started reaching into Africa. This was the biggest thing about we are dealing with cannibals. And also when they came to Americas, that was the thing that was associated in. And obviously some cultures did indulge into it. And in the Papua New Guinea, the Kuru disease was associated with eating brain and that so-called prion transmission. Okay, at the same time, we may frown upon it, but the Europeans have had their own peculiarities. Rotting cabbage, which another word called sauerkraut, is a popular German dish. Okay, the live preserved fish is a Scandinavian or Finnish dish, okay, called lutefisk. I think if I may be mispronouncing it. And Italians and French, I have some slide that they will actually eat songbirds. Okay, and as recently as within the last 6 months, due to famine in I think one of the African nations, they were shooting elephants to feed people. So, and obviously the French and snails are well known. Okay, and so this is, so, and the German word for pumpernickel is, it's such a strong smell. When you translate the word, it comes into pumperin, means to break wind. Okay, so it has to do with called a devil's fart. Okay, and okay, so and then again, how our culture has evolved, that our protein or receptor for amylin gene has multiplied, and that's why we're able to digest starch a lot more efficiently than our cousins chimpanzees. Okay, and that led to a smaller gut. And the information, basically, all this information is our body's way of communicating with the outside and gathering information. So these are the varieties of modalities. So we discussed, we are judging the quality of the stimuli that comes in as well as the intensity. And that travels from, eventually from varieties of receptors that we talked about in the beginning on the taste receptors or smell receptors, that goes through the nerves, initially the spinal cord, and then eventually the relay center in the brain called thalamus, and then finally it's interpreted in your brain, in your cortex, in the sensory cortex, And here's an example of the sensory cortex. As you can see, this occupies a fairly large area in front of behind the motor area. Okay, and then the varieties of other locations. The olfactory area is directly above your nose, so it's a straight shot from your nose onwards. The auditory cortex is over the temporal area, and the visual area, which we talked about when the science of vision that we talked earlier, part 2, which I talked about, it occupies a large area, and the taste gets a relatively small area. Okay, and these are various cranial nerves that I mentioned briefly in my first introduction class. So these are, the various. There's some that these are the most well-known senses that all of you are very familiar with. But the some that you're not familiar with are the so-called vestibular sense that has to do with balance. As long as it's working properly, that's fine. But if you have disturbances of your vestibular system, then there is no way you can't even stand up and function. The whole world is spinning around you, and that is, that's one of the big hazards of space travel, and that's how this astronauts are trained for as to how well they can function. And the other senses, so-called proprioceptive senses, that has to do with your movement. And the last but not the least is something called interoceptive. So that means your internal things. So for example, when you have a bloated stomach and your vagus nerve sends messages to your brain that not everything is all right, or even when you have to pass gas, your body senses, that there is something that's not quite healthy or kosher, as the case may be. And this is the basic, science. A little bit of science would not be out of place in this. And these are the classic nerves that we talked about earlier, the so-called trigeminal nerve, that supplies your eyes, your nose, and your lingual branch that supplies to your tongue and teeth. So these are the fifth nerve that it supplies the sensory aspect. So it's really this is, and then when it gets down to the anatomy of the taste system. These are the so-called taste buds, which are, like onion-like structure that is innervated by varieties of nerves. And there are special taste receptors depending upon which flavor you're talking about, the sweet versus red. Okay, so it's a very primal urge that occurred with evolution or homeostasis or need to maintain nutrition. And the sweet taste is really hardwired. Even babies would love sweet taste very easily. And now that in the classic old textbook, a local tongue was clearly demarcated as to which region is where, but their receptors are all over and diffuse. So that was the earlier science. Okay, and then there again, there are receptors not just on tongue, but also on the roof of your mouth, your palate. That's why when you swill a glass of wine, you can just, the taste buds literally hits your mouth, it hits your brain. And there were different perception as we talked about earlier. And these taste buds are not permanent or hardwired. They are replaced every few days. And the basic purpose of that is scanning for toxins and then going for taste. So survival is the biggest thing. So, okay. And again, a lot of the research comes from the mammalian models, for example, such as mice. And then there are genes that can be knocked out. And we already talked about as to how many taste genes a human being has. About 400 different types of genes are involved in smell and somewhat lesser number in taste. And the role of the G protein coupled receptors and the salt that we already mentioned, or I already mentioned earlier. Okay, and moving on to smell, the perception is from orbitofrontal region, and the contracts are directly addressable to the olfactory cortex. Okay, and then it forms the odor molecules are matched 1-to-1 into so-called a latch and key mechanism. Okay, so it's a very direct, only sense that is a very direct transmission or communication with your brain. The mucosa has varieties of hair cells called cilia. There are about 5 million of them in humans, while your canine friend has about 220 million. And again, just like taste receptor, these are replaced every 30 or so dose. Okay, and we talked about the role of heredity. Okay, and the poor sense in albinos that we talked about. Okay, and again, different people have different abilities that qualifies as them to be super smellers or super taster. and so this is, that this is one of the basic physiology of it. Now, there are a couple of other theories that this is not all latch and key. And another scientist that I think I'll get to earlier, named Lucas Turin, had proposed the so-called vibratory model of how sense is perceived. Now, initially, his ideas were hard to duplicate in laboratory. Because there are thousands of smells, and with these proteins, they can't all be latch and key. So it said that is his idea was that is vibratory motion of the proteins that takes place. Now, it was initially the whole idea was poo-pooed, but recently some of the research that has been duplicated, with varieties of hydrogen tagged smells or the heavy element of hydrogen has been tagged. So it's been proven that it may be onto something. Sure. Okay. And now, so and the nasal cycle, so how this is the anatomy of your nose. As you can see how it is very convoluted. The varieties of bony projections called turbinates, so, and these are the sinuses. Now that the structure of sinuses is kind of goofy and like one of nature's faux pas, that how the sinuses drain from the top. So no wonder you get sinusitis, type thing. So this is, and then it is kept moist all the time, and this varieties of airflow pattern, is detected. So, okay, and the one side is always kept moist, basically. So, and when you're sneezing, your mouth has to be open, otherwise it becomes hard to breathe, type thing. So, and so this is, basically it's a dominant, compelling heliophthalmic. So when, during sunlight, bright light makes you sneeze, basically sometimes, so it's called photic sneeze reflex. Okay, or the technical name is autosomal dominant compelling heliotropic outburst. Okay, so that's just very complicated way of describing smell. Okay, now I think this is a little bit more complicated. I'm going to skip through that, and then we already mentioned this about. Now we get down to the more interesting aspect of the smell, which has always been a pop in the popular culture or popular press, or on the last pages of popular scientific magazines. You'll see this ad of pheromones, and people are always looking for aphrodisiac. So that's been so the word origin is respect to pherin, means to transfer, and hormones means to excite. So basically, that's how these are Greek origin words. Okay, and that's always been fascinating type of thing. So okay, and sorry, but I'll get down to the pheromones a little later on in more details. Let me jump to it. My slides got jumbled up a little bit. Okay, yeah, here's the thing. So now, why am I talking about estrogens? Okay, a German biochemist, who was working on varieties of hormones. So his work was on isolating female hormones from working from rabbits. He isolated the progesterone and estrogens. This was the work that was done in 1930s. And these are important for human reproduction. Estrogens, obviously, those are the primary male counterpart of testosterone. Progesterone prepares the uterus for pregnancy, and again, it is directly related to progesterone levels rise with pregnancy, and the change initiate the trigger. So this was his groundbreaking discovery, and he was awarded Nobel Prize in 1939. Initially, he was the lead scientist at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and which was later on, after the war, was labeled as Max Planck Research Institute. Okay, and after that, he branched out into something called pheromones. That towards the end of his career, he came to isolating varieties of pheromones. So, and this was a hard work, and he worked on butterflies, inside the body, which are chemicals to attract another mates. Okay, obviously they play a huge role in animal reproduction, and he was fastidious and hardworking German. He was able to extract an oily substance from the glands of silk moths. So you can just see he used glands of the thousands and thousands of silk moths and was able to obtain small amount of substance. So when it was dipped and brought to a male silk moth, there was an obvious attraction. Okay, so this is, this was the groundbreaking discovery, which was called pheromones. Now there has already that initiated the search to see if this similar mechanism was evident in humans, but in spite of this numerous attempts, nobody has been able to successfully identify it. But you will find a lot of fly-by-night scientists, yes, will be promoting hormones for creating male to female attraction. Okay, and now in female hormone, this is this is from the breast and tissue type of thing. That now, and so there are some roles that are there, but not in a large sense. Okay, and then again, the babies have a glandular secretion that occurs, so you can see how that can be recognized. So this is the cuteness overload. This was from the New York Times. Okay, so sometimes we do have some evolutionary leftover this thing. So and this is the farmers and veterinarians recognize this. Ranchers will take the skin of a stillborn calf and will give it to the orphan to find surrogate mothers. So this is, this is how the bonding takes place in not just in animals, and also to some extent in humans. Okay, so that does have a small role, but not as much as we would wish. Okay, so we already talked about this. And this is, smell of the self, according to a study of the female body. This was the classical book by, Desmond Morris that was written in the, I think, 80s type of thing, that in Elizabeth, in England, a whole peeled apple was placed in the woman's armpit, and it was soaked with sweat, was given to a suitor who enjoyed the fragrance, so it became known as a love apple. So, okay. So this is, the smell is as an Israeli scientist named Omer Pollack had done some work on, the science of sweat. Okay, now, and similarly, in space, the smell can become a factor type thing. So, and the varieties of odors, are based on our activity and mood. And this sweat, even our sweat is affected by our diet, as to meat eaters have a different smell. Now, this was an interesting cyclic so-called dormitory effect, okay, when a sweat extract was presented to, control group, the tested group, they synchronized their period and type thing. So it was caused by a signal or pheromone in the sweat. So this is, this was one of those things, and again, this was used for females who were given smell of a sweat of males, and that clearly people showed preferences based on, that genetically distant males type thing. So this has, there was some scientific basis to that applied to sweat, and within sex or in opposite sexes. So there was some role that was described as something called the McClintock effect. Now, some of you, may remember the movie called Lonely Guy, starring Steve Martin. So where he is a lonely man who is trying to attract or pick up this lady, and he buys bottled sweat. Okay, and this was, the funny scene was as to how the bottled sweat was. You smell like Larry Bird. Okay, so she was able to pick it up, that thing. So, and again, these are clearly ethnic differences, that Asian do not have as many apocrine glands, and so they smell far less. And this ties in with the so-called dry or wet earwax. And these Westerners were, when they started traveling to Japan, they were considered smelly, hairy brutes. Okay, and a lot of these glands, have a lot to do with our sexual maturity. Okay, and this is, this was a TED talk that I came across. Okay, things. So, but I think, for sake of time, I don't think I'm going to dwell too much on it. Then getting onto the discovery of odor receptors. This was a few years ago, within, I think, early 20th century. Linda Buck and Excel, that discovers the odor receptors and organization of our one-to-one receptor system of the olfactory system took place, and they were the Nobel laureates for that. And I talked about The Secret of the Scent by Luca Turin as to how he had proposed a vibratory. Okay, and so huge surface area of our nose, has to do with cooling of the air as it enters brain and making it to more acceptable. And there are varieties of genes depending upon different receptors. And we talked about, that humans have about 400, rats have had about 1,500, dolphins, don't have any. Okay, so the evolutionary basis is still continues over varieties of species. Okay, and this interpretation is primarily in the brains. Okay, and so this is the so-called vibratory theory that I alluded to earlier by Luca Turin. Okay. Okay, and this varieties of Nobel Prizes have been awarded for, for 1994 was given to a scientist named Gilman and Rodoff for the G protein coupled receptors and cell signaling, and the odor receptors were awarded Nobel Prize with excellent. And then later on, the G protein coupled receptors were also recognized with Nobel Prize as recently as 2012 for the so-called lock and key mechanism. Okay. And as smell has functioned, has featured loudly in literature, the story by Nikolai Gogol, okay, officially the man whose nose leaves and his life as its own surpasses in rank. And so it talked about the symbolism of the class structure in Tsarist Russia. So that was, very cultural involvement in literature. Okay, and these are the variety, this is like a cartoon diagram of receptors, how it come about, how the olfactory bulbs as varieties of cell called glomeruli, and then the signal is transmitted to the, goes up from the molecule up to the olfactory bulb and directly into the brain. So I'm sorry, it starts from bottom of the receptors are at the receptor cells, which are attract the smell, and then they are transmitted to the brain as it go around. So how the neurotransmission takes place. And again, so we already talked about the varieties of receptors and genes, so these are some more examples of it. Okay, now different odors act in a variety of combination manners. These are the receptors and how they match with a combination of that takes place, activate different combination to create different perception in our brain. So that way we can identify close to 100,000 different odors. And some we have clearly lost, through evolution. That's why the dogs have a better sense of smell than we ever shall. Okay, so whether it's the nose or what the brain, that argument was settled in the 19th century. Okay, and okay, again, these are some of the more anatomical pictures as to how convoluted the olfactory epithelium is and how the varieties of glomeruli projection neuron into the olfactory bulbs takes place. And moving on to some of the molecular lock and key mechanism that I referred to earlier, the odor receptor. This is you can see how this is a 6,4 protein that is in the outside layer that matches with the G protein coupled receptors, and then the other mechanism is the so-called sodium-potassium channel that has to do with the different types of especially the salty taste that is transmitted via the ion channel. So these are the varieties of molecular mechanisms that take place, and these are some of the more complicated diagrams of the olfactory bulbs and very fine imaging that is taking place of the glomeruli and the map in the brain. Okay. And the smell has evolved basically as a smell self-defense by plant. The so-called mimosa plant is shy plant. When disturbed, it puckers up, so to speak. And sorry, I'm going to pause just for a second. Okay, so we talked about as to how smell is, basically a defense mechanism by plants. Okay, and similarly, plants have developed nicotine has a direct effect and for against insects. Plants are, so this is one way of plants have evolved to develop certain chemicals for self-defense mechanisms. Okay, all right, and varieties of smell effects, okay, and hydrogen sulfide, it's one of those we all produce gas, which is methyl mercaptans, which are the, cause the smells, so this can, and the gas can be a breaking wind, which can occur as many as, 14, 15 times per day, and we all expel, at least about 150 cc of gas, okay, and that can be flammable actually. So now I don't know who did the experiments for that. That's okay. Again, so we're talking about Darwin's exist, so when smell has been associated with lower classes, and again, and women were always considered smelly because of their menstrual periods, and men have, again, but at the same time, your own smell, you're not disgusted, okay, and again, the smell has been associated with sex for a long time in the sort of Freudian way. Now, and there are certain tribes, which have with a huge involvement with smell, is the Onji tribe in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, has to have varieties of odor metaphors. Oh, sorry, this one on the Andaman Islands, my mistake. And so this is the greetings would be described as, how's your nose? Okay. Illness is a loss of excess of odor. So death is considered as a loss of odor. So depending upon evolution. Again, varieties of smell and taste disorders, which we all experienced during COVID. And there are varieties of medical names that have been associated with smell disorders, dysgeusia, hypogeusia, varieties of, pantageusia. Okay, and this made anosmia, we saw that, very easily, and reduced smells and distorted smells. So this had the, and this a lot of the causes before COVID were associated with hereditary tumors, and smoking affected this thing. So this is, again, varieties of mental disorders can also cause, like schizophrenics have this hallucination of bad smells that develops sometimes, and this is very apparent as to how the roles are related, because you try to drink a glass of wine with your nose pinched and you'll see it will just taste like basic liquid. Upper respiratory infection. So, and there are some horrendous disorders that can occur. There is something called cacosmia, and that everything smells like poop, basically. So, it'd be tough to live through. Okay, and this was a quote from the well-known comics of several decades ago, Dave Barry, opening of, I've never seen, but almost teams that show up in beer, guys having smell like bus seats. So, battle of sexes. So the smell, women have a more stronger sense of smell, and they, so this is again hormonal status, and evolutionary role has a lot to do with it. So, okay, and again, as we get older, our sense of smell decreases, and this was an example. The overhyped smell example of Helen Keller is, was severely had severe disabilities. So, and again, and sometimes, we humans versus animal, that, we certain beliefs that we have, that they're not always correct, and sometimes, but we do have some dog owners can identify, their own dog's blanket. So, okay, and we think we give ourselves sort of that, our sense of smell, but a research experiment was done with a lot of grad students, were allowed to walk on 4, and they were able to compete fairly well with her animal friends in terms of detecting, varieties of smells, and especially that of chocolate or other favorite foods. And then varieties of books have been written, about books for this, news about fragrance, okay, and the neurogastronomy book that I mentioned earlier, okay, and so the art of smell is basically get your sniff is to get chemicals. So one sniff is enough for, usually it takes more than 2 or 3, okay. So, this is how one of the ways which we can, and sometimes, and power of suggestion has a huge, this thing. Sometimes BBC in the 70s had played a hoax type thing as to making suggestion that you're smelling bad, and at the same time, the Nazi Germany had this derogatories about smelly Jews, that's how the anti-Semitism was spread. And again, this is during the plague era. This was before when the microbial theory became available. It's, how the physician used to go around wearing a separate type of mask to avoid the miasma and smell. So this was the popular theory, okay, for smell that was, before the discovery of microbes, by Pasteur. Okay, during the plague, the varieties of incense, and incense have been very popular since the time of Napoleon and Josephine that we talked about earlier. Okay, that Napoleon told Josephine, "Do not bathe since I'm coming home," and so he was associating with the smell of perfume, and his favorite flower was a violet. Okay, and and again, so. And sometimes, people do have allergy to varieties of perfumes from time to time. Again, so that can be a real downer for some people who are very. And again, the classic line that Robert Duvall had: "I love the smell of napalm" from the Vietnam era movie. I think it was Deer Hunter, if I'm not. No, I'm not sure. I think so. Okay, so that was in one of his movies. And again, those who have traveled in the concentration camps, or have lived, the smell. And again, when we, from a medical, as a medical person, we were always squeezed on the so-called acetone smell of diabetes mellitus, or the smell of urea in renal failure, or the smell of maple syrup disease, and the smell of menstrual cycle that we alluded to earlier. Okay, and this is the quote from Shakespeare from Hamlet. Okay, it's now the very witching time of nights when the churchyards yawn and hell breathes out contagion to the world. So that was the reference to the plague. Okay, and now there are some human variations or exceptions that take place. Okay, and Parkinson's disease develops smell dysfunction that has to do with either the parts of the brain that are intricately connected with degeneration, and this was and based on that, and also that has a role in Alzheimer's screening. University of Pennsylvania had developed something called a smell identification test, and those who had somewhat impaired smell, went on to develop Alzheimer's disease. And interestingly, there is a woman named Joy Milner, who was uniquely endowed or gifted being able to smell Parkinson's disease. She was given shirts of varieties of Parkinson's patients, and she was able to diagnose from control to object patients in 11 out of 12. And not just that, the 12th one that she diagnosed as Parkinson, or identifies, when the man went on to develop Parkinsonism at a later age. So there was a quirk of nature. Okay, and similarly, that the experiment that was done, the amyloid Alzheimer's disease associated with amyloid plaques, and the plaques were isolated from autopsies, and they were fed to mice, and these mice later on to lose their sense of smell. So there is some relationship, again, that was the earlier literature, now more reliable. And the story of perfume, this was one of the story about the story of perfume and murder. So it was a mystery story that was written. And we already talked about, in the literature, the strong association. We talked about Marcel Proust, various stories by Virginia Woolf, and so on and so forth. Luca Turin, which I alluded to earlier, had written a novel, Smell of Sweat. And so there is an interesting association. Okay, and the smell of freshly roasted coffee in 1984. Okay, that we talked about, that people, and again, smell the movies, type of thing. So there was, back for a while, there was a smell-o-vision, and the movie where people were given cards to sniff, and aroma that was released from the under the seat, type thing, and then people were given scratch and sniff cards. So that was an experiment. It was never really panned out to too much, type of thing. So there were some varieties of ways to attract audience and engage people was undertaken. Okay. again, smelling computers. And so this is, again, this is it's crazy ideas that were tried basically. So, and again, these ideas have come back with virtual reality. Okay, and again, more reference to the literature, not just from Faulkner to Wagner to Emily Dickinson. So there have been references to smell all throughout the literature. And this is an example of one of her poems. The essential oils are wrung from the attar. Attar is, by the way, a Persian word. And again, the Mughals and the Persians were big onto perfume, and the perfume was a big export thing. So, and from the ancient times, was exported from the east to Rome. Okay, so it was a big business, and then again, the classical rise of perfume industry. Okay, as the classical fragrance was Chanel No. 5, which went on to become a big market-busting smell. Okay, and this is, the history of perfume is very old. It goes back to not just Mesopotamia, Indus Valley, Egypt, and incense burning. Okay, and later Rome's Arabs. So it just, the smell has a long history. And Coco Chanel made an empire from it, and the varieties of smells that there are varieties of layers of smell that are incorporated in building up a perfume, and it's a whole complicated science. And one of the more popular this thing, along with Chanel No. 5, is perfume called Shalimar, which is, the name dates back to a lake in Kashmir, northern India. Okay, and after a while, you can only smell it to so much, because after that you develop something called olfactory fatigue. Okay, and then this is, it's a $13 billion worldwide market for varieties of smell. And the classic one, which was Marilyn Monroe, said, she was asked a question by a reporter as to what do you wear to bed, and her tongue-in-cheek answer was Chanel No. 5. Okay, and so this is, creating a perfume requires a variety of trial and error, and it's hard work, and the people who are expert at it. And so this is how so it's like a base is incorporated on top of it, the green accord flavor, and then floral accord. So there are varieties of layers that are built top notch. Is very quick acting type thing. In the bottom is the base, a bottom note, and the middle notes will stay for a few hours, and while the bottom notes will linger on sometimes until next morning. So these are the varieties of layers that are built upon. Okay, and so that's it's a whole science and art that is associated with it. And the base is usually thick and syrupy, such as sandalwood or frankincense, lichens, varieties of grasses, animal senses, and then on top of it, the floral senses are incorporated. Okay, and the word perfume is it means through, fumar means smoke. Okay, and so these are the varieties of sources people have scoured all over the world. The Yang Lang flower from the Comoros Island, and sandalwood from India, cloves, the vanilla extract from Madagascar. Varieties of smells have come. Okay, and then obviously the animal senses that come around are, the whale, the civet, the beaver, and musk. Okay, and these are all, this is all incorporated by varieties of chemists. Okay, and so it's a very complicated business, basically. And again, the people are searching all over the world. How they would go into the South American forests and jungles to collect smells with headspace technology. Varieties of compound are collected, and with gas chromatography, they're literally taking like a snapshot of the perfume, and then they're genetically analyzed, basically, and then created. And in earlier days, it was a man-made. It was very labor-intensive work, starting from Egypt, Persia. The saffron has a huge, valuable mogra is the Indian flower, which is, and then the sunflower. So this is the classical scent merchant, in some out east. Okay, and this is an interesting tape that I will just share it with you.
Pensé aujourd'hui et peut-être un parfum oublié demain. Personne jusque-là n'avait pensé à sauvegarder des parfums qui ont été des grands succès commerciaux à certaines époques et puis qui les ont laissés disparaître. Donc finalement, il est quand même très intéressant de savoir quelles étaient les créations qui avaient été faites auparavant.
Pourquoi l'osmothèque? Parce que je voulais retrouver un petit peu ce passé historique de la parfumerie. Et en même temps, quand je faisais un parfum, souvent on me disait c'est bon, mais ça me rappelle quelque chose que ma grand-mère ou ma tante portait. Et vous savez, autrefois, c'était meilleur. Alors c'était très agaçant. Et donc, j'ai voulu en avoir le cœur net. J'ai émis cette idée d'essayer de faire une banque de données olfactives, d'essayer de conserver un peu nos parfums de la manière la meilleure et également d'essayer de retrouver les chefs-d'œuvre du passé. En 1988, on a déposé le nom Osmothèque à partir de deux mots d'origine grecque, osmé, osmier, odeur, et teke, rangement. Donc Osmothèque, qui a été inauguré après en 1990. Et depuis, ça s'est développé. On a commencé avec un peu moins de 400 parfums. Aujourd'hui, on a près de 3000.
Nous avons dans notre collection une gamme de parfums très intéressante de la fin du 19e, début 20e siècle, qui sont des parfums déjà perdus, qu'on ne trouve plus aujourd'hui.
Okay, so you can see that the French have a really science behind it. Okay, and again, this is through the classical this thing as to how waking up with a smelling salt. I showed you part of this picture, I think, in the first lecture, and the ammonia irritates irritates. So that's one of the ways we can be awakened when somebody was fainted. So this is goes back to the Roman times, and this is. And again, so this is still currently being used in some special circumstances, may be useful. And the classic poems of Omar Khayyam, The Rose by Any Other Name, that was from Shakespeare's, obviously well known, The Queen of Flowers by Sappho, in the Perfume Gardens, in the 16th century. Okay, and then the flower is a big business, how millions are produced, and during at Valentine's. So it's very part of the culture. Okay, and the big perfumes that are there are cinnamon, exotic, which are mint, frankincense, which is spiritual, ambergris, unusual, with whale, jasmine. It's always been popular. Okay, so this is varieties of. Okay, and again, this was one of the reasons for the Greek journey, starting from the time of Alexander, and there was the Roman coins have been discovered in India. Okay, and this again, even Herodotus mentions varieties of perfumes coming from east, and was lamenting the exchange that they were sending silver as part of the trade. So this was and some recent books have been written about this sort of sea route. Okay, and again, so this was one of the guy who wrote The English Patient, and this was one of his work about the cinnamon trader. Okay, and this cinnamon peeler's wife, you touch your belly and my hands in the dry and said essential odds. So this is, it has, but spices have a huge role, and plants and smell. Okay, let's So this is, the smells of plants are collected, and they're, primarily a lot of the chemicals are volatile terpenes, and they're collected, and then different smells are, exuded by varieties of plants. And scent marking by animals is well known: dogs, mice, rats, deer, male tiger. It leaves a frequent smell. Skunks, obviously, everybody knows, which is a chemical which is very repungent, butyl percaptan. Similarly, butterflies have varieties of smell. So this is, when the first sign of when a tiger matures, then it begins to mark this territory, okay, with urine and scent and leaving scratch marks. Okay, so this is, this is one way of evolutionary basis for it. Again, in Moby Dick, the ambergris, which was again of a sick whale, so there is a reference to it, extensively. So this is, when ages, it's a sweet earthy smell. So it's also mentioned in 1001 Arabian Nights. Okay. Okay. And again, musk, from China and India, muskas, which is a Sanskrit word. Okay. And civet smell, which is cat-like, from the perineal glands. Okay. And again, there are references to that wide and spread in literature. We talked about the body sense, and earlier. Okay. And there are varieties of computer chips that are being involved as to whether there are sensors that are being developed, so which can detect as to whether you have smell or not. So e-nose, so to speak. So computer science is making its forays into all other disciplines. Okay, and then again, whether you love or hate new car smell. Okay, so this is, one of the ways, the Ford was experimenting, because that smell can be really, a health hazard at times. So that's the chemical that are used. Okay, life without a scent. So there are, and there are people who have lost sense. So there are supportive organizations that are developed as to helping people with total anosmia. Okay, and digital taste. I think I have. Okay, so that is something futuristic. Whether it will be, say, a real practical use, that remains to be seen. Now, but this one is a lot more interesting and very practical.
Super tasters are basically people who experience more intense tastes than do others. You're sitting across the table having breakfast and there's a sugar bowl on the table. You taste the sugar bowl and you're a super taster. I'm not a super taster. I'm going to be getting about 1/3 of the sweetness that you are. And that's enough to really make for dietary differences because people eat based on what they can experience. One of the things we learned about super tasters that's particularly fun is that super tasters get more pleasure from their favorite foods and more displeasure from their least favorite foods. Super tasters, we know something of what makes them different, and one of them is anatomy. That is, if you look at the tongue of a super taster, that tongue will not look the same as the tongue of someone who's not a super taster. When the subject comes in, after we take a quick look, we paint the tongue with essentially a Q-tip dipped in blue food coloring from the supermarket. We paint the tongue, person swallows a couple times to distribute the dye. When they stick their tongue out, we then put a flat piece of plastic on it so we can flatten the tongue for photography. We have the subject sitting in a dental chair. The microscope comes in, takes a very careful look, takes a picture, and the picture goes right into a computer so we can have a permanent copy of it. And this will allow us later to print these out, to count. We actually count an area that's the size of a reinforcer. You'd put a notebook paper. It has about a 6 mm hole in the middle. We place that hole so that one edge of the hole touches the midline. The other edge of the hole is touching the edge of the tongue at the tip. So you can see how the place you put it is absolutely defined. And we count the fungiform papilla on one side, and then we count the fungiform papilla on the other side. And as you count them, the best super taster we've ever studied had 60 fungiform papilla in that little tiny circle, 6 mm across. One of the things that's fun to do when you're doing super taster research is to get an idea of how the incidence of super tasting varies around the world. Typically, white Caucasians have the lowest number of super tasters, and men the very lowest of that. In other words, women are more likely than are men to be super tasters. And around the world, almost any country other than the US, France, Spain, some of these countries, any other country is going to have more super tasters.
I think that was interesting. So I think, we just have given a bird's eye view of smell and taste, as to there is a whole involvement, not just from ancient times to the modern science. So hopefully this has been of interesting to you, and next time we'll continue with hearing, which is equally important, if not more. Okay, so I will send out the recordings to everybody else as you